You're listening to Margins and Meaning with John Wilson. Margins and Meaning accepts zero responsibility for remakes, delaminations, fractures, open contacts, poor scans, missing opposings, non-index bites, or any case that miraculously hits your inbox without a requested shade. Anything I say on the show is just my opinion. It's not gospel. It's not CE. It's not legal advice, and it definitely may induce emotional damage. Please, if you choose to listen to anything that was discussed here today, you do so at your own risk, preferably with a full night's sleep, sharp burrs, and a clinician actually realize that there is, in fact, more shades in the shade guide than just A2. Listen at your own risk. Thank you. Welcome back to Margins and Meaning. I'm John Wilson. Last episode was about protecting the work. This one is about the people who actually sharpen us enough to do that well. Before we ever learn anything technical on this side of the craft, before we understand the tools or the materials, most of us encounter something much more important. We encounter people. People actually influence us how we think. People who challenge what we believe is possible. People who expand the boundaries of what we thought our work could become. If you're fortunate in your career, you'll meet a few of these individuals along the way. But if you're very fortunate, you'll eventually realize that these moments weren't just professional encounters. They were actually maybe turning points in your life and career. Moments where someone else's perspective quietly reshaped the trajectory of your own. There's a phrase most of us have heard at some point in their life. I know it was a little bit longer in mine, but iron sharpens iron. It's one of those sayings that sounds super powerful the first time you hear it. It carries weight. It sounds wise, but over time, it almost becomes invisible. You see it printed on posters or maybe hear a coach say it to a player, but I don't think that most people ever really stop to think about what it actually means. Because when you really look at the process, iron sharpening iron is not comfortable. It's friction. It's resistance. It's two hard surfaces grinding against each other, right? Sometimes it throws sparks. Sometimes it creates heat, but sometimes it actually bruises your ego. But if you look closely at those moments in your life where you truly improved, where your thinking changed, where your standards were pushed higher, where your perspective expanded, those moments almost never came from comfort. They came from friction. They came from being challenged. They came from encountering someone who forced you to look at things differently than you had before. And when I think about that in my own career, one person immediately comes to mind. Dr. Ramsey Amin. If you know Ramsey, he's an amazing person, but I can tell you right now, Ramsey is one of the most respected implant surgeons in this country. But when I think about our relationship, the thing that stands out the most is not his reputation. It's maybe the way he thinks. The first time you work for someone like that, you realize something pretty quickly. You're not just dealing with a clinician sending you cases. You're dealing with someone who sees the problem differently. And that can be incredibly inciting and incredibly uncomfortable at the same time, because when someone operates on that level, they start asking questions that force you to examine the way you've always done things. Why is this designed this way? Why is this material being used? Is this actually the best solution, or just one we're used to? Those kind of conversations are where real growth happens. But they're also the moments that test your ego. Because sometimes the honest answer is you don't actually know. You know, one of the things you eventually learn when you stay in front of a craft long enough is there's levels to thinking. You can be competent in your field, you can work hard, you can produce good work. And then you encounter someone who approaches the same problems from a completely different angle. And suddenly you realize the ceiling that you thought existed isn't actually there yet. That realization can be humbling, but it can also be energizing because it reminds you that there's always another level to reach. That's what happens when iron meets iron. When I look back on my own career, the biggest leaps forward didn't happen because I worked harder. They happened because someone forced me to think harder. Before I met Ramsey, my approach to the craft was very clear in my own mind. I believed deeply in engineering first, the structure, the durability, the function of it. My mindset was simple. If the prosthetic lasts, if it performs, if it solves the problem mechanically, well, then we've done our job very well. And that mindset wasn't wrong. In fact, it served my laboratory very well for many years. But what I hadn't fully pushed myself toward yet was the artistic ceiling of the work. Not just making something that worked, but maybe making something that moved people emotionally when they saw it. And that difference matters because one thing can be correct and still not be complete. From the very beginning with Ramsey, I noticed something was different. Over the course of my career, I've had the privilege of working with some incredibly talented clinicians, surgeons with remarkable hands, people with tremendous knowledge, people who could execute at a very high level. But when I first started working with Ramsey, there was something about him that I couldn't quite put my finger on. At first glance, I couldn't define what made him different. But over time, I saw it. You see, I saw a man that not only had the talent in his hands and the wisdom in his brain, he had the genuine care in his heart. And that combination is rare. Because when someone possesses all three of those things, skill, intelligence, and heart, something interesting begins to happen. The work stops being just transactional. It becomes collaborative. When Ramsey and I first began working together, I could feel that immediately. He inspired me to be more than what I was when I first met him. He was always encouraging me to improve, always pushing me to think a bit differently. Always about the problems that we were solving together. And it wasn't in a critical way, but in a way that made you want to rise to that occasion. What fascinated me most was his ability to see the problems clearly and connect with my solutions. That dynamic between us started 12 years ago, and the goal was always the same: to own each other's efforts, to uplift and complement the tasks together, to make the final results greater than what either of us could have accomplished alone. And when challenges came, which they always do in complex work, Ramsey never approached those moments by pulling back. He leaned in, he tried harder, he reflected deeper, and that forced me to evolve as well. But the most important thing I did was something else. It made me stay curious. It made me stay excited about what was next. It gave me a resurgence to think more creatively, and it gave me an opportunity to thrive in the process. Guys, I'm going to share a story here. There's moments from those early days with Ramsey that has stayed with me for years. At the time, I would say our relationship was just starting to grow. I would say we were in that courtship phase where we were learning how each of us was thinking or approaching problems, learning how, each of us was going to communicate with one another. And in many ways, Ramsey became that mentor to me in a way that I fully didn't recognize at the time. Looking back now, I'm not even sure what I was being gifted in those moments. You see, by that point in my career, I already had a tremendous amount of experience making things that lasted, based on structural integrity and engineering to be predictable and functional. I knew my lab's lane. I knew what we were great at. And while I had a tremendous amount of full arch dentistry behind me, I had so much more to learn. Full arch zirconia was a smaller part of that work 15 years ago, but I can tell you, making zirconia back in the day look great was tough. I remember going to Ramsey's office one day. He brought me in his back of where the lab was. Just the two of us were there. He pulled out several cases that we had produced together, and then he pulled out some cases that he had done previously with another very respected lab. And he placed the work side by side. Now, some people might see that as a way of shaming me. They might have felt like it was a moment designed to point out the vast differences in aesthetics and make me feel small. But I think differently about that moment. I want to think, and I want to hold this in my heart, that he was inspiring me to grow, to get to the next level, to somehow inspire me and my team to improve with one visual goal in mind. Because what Ramsey was actually doing in that moment was not criticizing the work. He was showing me what was possible. He was showing me a visual target. And standing there looking at those prosthetics, I realized something really uncomfortable. The work we had produced was solid. It was functional. It was engineered well. But that artistry, the life of the work, that emotional connection to the patient would feel when they saw it, well, I still had room to grow. And that created a tension inside of me. That engineering in me wanted durability, predictability, that structural integrity. The artist in the craft was now asking for something more. And that tension is where the real work actually began. Because when someone shows you a higher standard, you have a choice. You can protect your ego, or you can expand your vision. I think a great mentor doesn't tear you down. A great mentor expands your vision. Ramsey didn't tell me my work had no value. He showed me that the ceiling was actually higher than what I allowed myself to chase. And once you see that standard, once you truly understand what is possible, guys, you just can't unsee it. That was the moment. That was the moment I realized I had just encountered someone who could sharpen me for years to come. Some really powerful takeaways from that office visit. I remember driving home and thinking about what just had happened. Ramsey never raised his voice. He never really criticized the work. He never really said the words like, "This isn't good enough." It was simply showing me what was possible. And that distinction matters because, criticism can shut a person down. But inspiration, that opens them up. I started thinking about my team. I started thinking about the lab, about the standards we were holding ourselves to. The work that we were producing was good, guys. It was functional. It was reliable. But I began asking myself a different question. What would happen if we pushed the artistry further to the front? What would happen if we combined the engineering disciplines we believed in with the aesthetic potential that Ramsey had just shown me? That question started a new chapter in my lab. It pushed me to study more, to experiment more, to challenge my own assumptions about what the work could become. And looking back now, that moment standing in Ramsey's office was more than just a comparison of prosthetics. It actually was a turning point, because great mentors don't just correct you. They expand what you believe is possible. And once that vision expands, you begin chasing it. Not because someone demanded it, but because you can't ignore it anymore. That's the gift of mentorship. It doesn't impose a standard, it reveals one. Guys, growth never happens in isolation. When Ramsey pushed me to a higher aesthetic standard, I had to bring that challenge back to the lab. And that's where things really became complicated. You see, I've shared over the years that I've intentionally chosen smaller, more manageable things. I chose to keep my client list limited and to specific teams that were actually really making a difference in our lives and my happiness and the ability to create great things. I chose to keep the staff smaller. And I really tried very hard to keep the workflow manageable. But guys, with any in-demand lab, work doesn't arrive in a perfectly balanced way. There's always peaks and valleys. And in those early years, we did what most labs do. We just gritted our teeth and pumped out the work. And I really saw the stress that it had on my staff. I saw them not wanting to let me down. I saw the real cost of making sure we did what we said we'd do. So when we were asked to kick up our aesthetics, well, of course, that was super stressful for the staff. You see, all of us saw our products as good. None of us thought we weren't giving our all until Ramsey actually pointed it out. Now imagine bringing that realization back to a team that already believes they're doing their best. That's not an easy conversation. I can tell you the ceramists were frustrated. They took it personally. And honestly, that reaction made sense. Because when someone tells you the work can be better, it can feel like criticism, even when it's not meant that way. So my role in that moment wasn't just to push the work forward. My role was to try to instill growth, to show the why to the problem, to share how we may be able to overcome this challenge. I tried very hard to reassure them that this is growth. That growth does not mean that what you did yesterday was worthless. It means that maybe that ceiling has moved a bit. It means the craft itself has evolved. And if the craft evolves, well, we have to evolve with it. That led us down the next new path. We began experimenting with the new liquid ceramic systems that were just being released, and training a ceramist to think differently than the traditional build-up path what we had been using for years to move to a more simple colorization method took time. It took time to get the results that we were after, and that cost me more friction. But I tried my damnedest to stay calm. I allowed my ceramist to work a little longer on the work. I scheduled out more time on these cases, not because they actually needed it, but because it allowed the window to make sure we actually could make a meaningful change. Growth takes time. Aesthetics are subjective. Each person sees things slightly differently. So having a goal of repetition, to have a standard and set it and be owning it, well, that took time to develop. And guys, I think that matters. Because one of the most overlooked parts of growth is that it's expensive. Not always expensing in money, but sometimes that expense in patience, in humility, in time, in that emotional energy, in the willingness to actually let people struggle without letting them believe that they're failing. That's leadership, guys. Not just setting the direction, but carrying the room in an emotional way that actually made the standards move. The great thing about the time we're living in is all these amazing new materials that are in constant development. New zirconia, new ceramics, new coloring systems. The workflows are changing. The pathways to digital is changing. But I can tell you, that also produces some of the most tough conversations, amazing pushback from staff, because now we get the, hey boss, we just figured out this product and now you're switching to something new? And guys, I understand that, but because every time you feel that you maybe mastered some part of something and the ground shifts again, well, I can tell you for me, it was never about chasing the next new shiny object. The goal was always to improve in small little iterations. And when the material science changed, we were able to achieve more natural aesthetics, add a little more life to the product, add a little more subtlety to it, a little more truth in the work. And that's all I was really after. And it wasn't easy convincing people that this next new thing would aid us in that real goal. But we were constantly pushing the needle to learn, I can tell you that. Especially in this very turbulent time where the technology and artistry were leveling up faster than ever. And our clients' expectations were going that way as well. The expert level you spend years trying to achieve doesn't stay untouched forever. That expert level is being challenged by people faster than ever today. And that's not something to fear. I think it's something to embrace. Because that's exactly what iron sharpening iron looks like inside this living craft that we're producing. It means keeping that bar moving. It means looking at the work and keep growing with it. It means that you never really get to retire mentally from the pursuit of being better. Guys, the last 15 years of my career has really been shaped and refueled my curiosity of it all. Digital and taking my analog wisdom and finding a way to really take it to the next level has really changed everything. But more importantly, I think it allowed me to attract the attention of great mentors like Ramsey. And after our courtship phase, the evolution of our relationship was based on a deep mutual respect. While he was absolutely my mentor, I think we grew stronger together because, and I say this carefully because I don't want to sound braggadocious, but I think he would agree that I also mentored him in the digital revolution. Through our combined failures, we grew together. And I am certain that this is something he feels strongly and grateful for as well. He's told me more than once that he wished he had met me 10 years earlier. And he jokes and he forbids me from ever retiring until he does. That kind of relationship is a gift, my friends, because when two people respect each other enough to challenge each other, well, then growth never stops. What began as one man showing me a higher aesthetic target evolved into two professionals sharpening each other from different sides of the same craft. He stretched my eye. I helped stretch the process. He pushed me creatively. I helped carry part of the digital translation. And through that exchange, the work got better. But more importantly, so did we. That experience sharpened the way I looked at the teams I work with now. Not just my staff, but other great clients around this country. It became a framework for me, that mutual respect, that curiosity, that shared ownership, and the willingness to challenge each other in the pursuit of better work. That's where I find the most satisfaction now. And that's how I still stay curious. As your career grows, something subtle happens. The further you move into a leadership position, the fewer people continue to challenge you. Not because they necessarily agree with everything that you have to say, but maybe because that hierarchy changes the conversation. I remember realizing this one day in the lab. We were reviewing a case and we had the team around and we were talking about it. And earlier in my career, the room would be full of debate. We would have had, people questioning the design. People would suggest another approach. Ideas would bounce around the room. And I think the work would get better because we were willing to challenge each other's thinking. But somehow, something changed that day. I suggested a direction and the room just went quiet. Everybody just nodded. I remember looking around the room waiting for somebody to push back. Because years earlier, that would have happened immediately. I would have heard, John, that's just not going to work. Or maybe we should do it a different way. But this day, the room was quiet. And that silence told me something important. Leadership had changed the room. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but subtly. Because people defer to responsibility. They defer to experience. And while respect is valuable, too much deference can be dangerous. Because if nobody questions the idea stops improving. That moment forced me to think differently about leadership. I realized my responsibility wasn't just to guide the work, it was to maybe protect that friction that makes the work better. Because if nobody challenges your thinking, well, you stop sharpening your edge. Leadership can unintentionally isolate you. And if iron sharpens iron, well, maybe isolation will actually dull that blade. Guys, over the years, I realized something really cool about teaching. My greatest experiences I have today are when I have a younger tech or, truthfully, anyone that I'm teaching, not just listen to me, but truly hear what I'm trying to present. There are these aha moments in life where you're shaping or sharing a concept and in a very definitive way, but then you present what I call a what-if situation. What if we thought about this differently? What if we tried this different approach? What if we had one more detail here? What if we were able to improve that? I think the what-ifs in life are what push us to evolve into real growth. When I can instill that in anyone, man, that's a great day. I've seen that moment happen more than once in my career, and you can just envision it like this. You're standing with someone at a bench or design station, and you're talking about a case with very simple outcomes. At first glance, they're just following the steps, they're listening, they're doing what they've been taught. And then you just ask one right question. Not a question meant to trap them, a question meant to really reopen up that room. What if we looked at the emergence this way? What if we soften this line angle? What if the contour that we're supporting here is actually following the face just a little differently? What if we stop trying just to finish this case and starting to try to understand what the case is asking from us? And then you see it happen. That pause, the shift, the look back to the work. And that's the moment the person stops just executing and starts actually thinking about it. That's the moment curiosity takes over again. That's the moment that growth begins. Because curiosity is what drives evolution in any craft. And when I see someone experience that moment, when I see that spark of curiosity take hold, that's a great day. Because that's when the work stops being something you simply do and something that maybe you continue to explore. And in those moments, if I'm really honest about it, I think about Ramsey. I think about that small back office lab. I think about those cases side by side. And I realize at some point, without fully seeing it happen, the gift got passed forward. So it's time to tie this all together. You know, that phrase, iron sharpens iron. Most people just imagine strength. But I think what they often miss is the friction of that statement, the sparks, the tension, because sharpening anything is not a gentle process. It's resistance applied in the pursuit of something better, right? And when I look back across my career, the people who had the greatest influence on me were the ones who challenged me the most, the ones who forced me to think deeper, the ones who refused to accept those comfortable answers, the ones who quietly showed me what I was really capable of becoming. And because of them, I became better than I would have been without them. Not because they made my life easier, but because they made me better. And if we're fortunate enough in this life, we eventually get the opportunity to return that gift, to sharpen someone else, to stand across from another person and quietly show them what the next level actually is, to ask that what-if question that actually changes the direction of their thinking, to protect the friction that keeps the craft alive. Because in the end, most of us can point to that one moment when someone stood across from us and quietly showed us the next level, and honestly changed the trajectory and the curiosity of our work. I know who did that for me. All right, my friends, this has been John Wilson. This has been Margins and Meaning. I can't thank you enough for your time. And until next time, I say thank you and take care.